thank you to the London Dev Group for having me here and to Go Cardless for hosting us here. This is broadly my talk for DevOps Streaming tomorrow, but with some bonus content because I was expecting to have some extra time. Robert used up quite a lot of time somehow, so see how that goes. So what I wanted to talk about is the culture part of DevOps. So it's kind of natural as techies, we want to focus on building a CI pipeline, what we're going to do with the branching strategy, all those sorts of things. But to really make it work well, there's a whole load of things that need to happen around that, and it needs to kind of live and breathe through the whole project. And that's really what I want to get across today. So who am I to talk to you about these things? My name's Aidan Harding. I'm Technology Director at Nebula Consulting. We're a consulting partner based in London. I've been in Salesforce ecosystem for about 10 years, tech generally for about 25 years, so predate Git, for example. So doing it for a while. And what I want to... Oh, is that coming through? There we go. No echo. Thank you. Yeah. So often when we start off on a DevOps project, we'll have this wonderful idea of how this is going to go. The customers are going to love it. There's going to be no problems in production. Everything's awesome. It's going to deploy beautifully. And then we deploy it. There we go. And it doesn't quite go the way that we'd expected. Slightly morally dubious source of that quote, but it's very accurate. That was Mike Tyson's words, that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face by Mike Tyson. And, you know, when these things do go wrong, when we find out that the customer doesn't love it because they've never seen it before, or the deployment goes all wonky because Salesforce generally, or there are bugs or whatever else there is that's going on, you can really react to that in two different ways. You could try to become very defensive about it and say, okay, well, we've got to put in procedures. We cannot have mistakes. We're going to add in all the things we need so that no one will ever get a mistake to production ever again. And that tends to be a very brittle approach. That tends to fail, really. Whereas what we could do is say, well, how can we fix things as quickly as possible? How can we move in smaller, less risky steps? And that whole kind of approach to delivering software is really what the guys who originally came up with the Agile Manifesto were talking about. So I want to go right back to the Agile Manifesto. When people talk about Agile these days, often the things that come to mind are the tools of Agile. Scrum, storyboards, Kanban, blah, blah, blah. But it originally started just from a set of principles. And each of those principles, they put forward in pairs of statements. And I want to look at those principles, and I want to relate them to actual behaviors and try and make these things a bit more concrete for you. So in each of these pairs, there are two parts to it, and they say that both of these things are valuable, but one's more important than the other. So really their first principle was individuals and interactions are more important than the processes and the tools. So processes and tools, important. Individuals and interactions, more important. And when we create processes and tools, what we tend to do is we constrain the behavior that people can have with our processes and tools. And sometimes that's a great thing. Constraints can actually be enabling. If you think of standards and things, like paper comes in a standard size, except for America, and you could build a printer that just has to handle those two standards. You don't have to worry about anything else. So some of these constraints are actually allowing us to focus on changing the things that matter, and they're actually enabling us to do better work. But there are other kind of constraints that make it harder for us to do things. We get these confounding constraints. Like if we decide we have a strict DevOps rule, that we're only going to deploy once a week on Wednesday mornings. And if someone discovers a bug on Wednesday afternoon, they're out of luck. They're going to have to wait for 6.5 days to change it. And that actually makes it much harder for us to deliver software. So that's the kind of thing they were getting at when they were talking about individuals over processes and tools. They talk about working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, they're not saying don't document. They're just saying that the software is the thing that delivers the value. That's what the end users actually use, is the software. They might need documentation to enable them to use it. We certainly need design documentation to explain why we built it the way we did and the top-level designs. But comprehensive documentation isn't necessarily going to help us to deliver more value to our end users. And it's easy to fall into the trap of trying to write down in documentation every single thing that the software is supposed to do. And you find yourself having a really hard time in Microsoft Word or Google Docs trying to write down very precisely what the software should do. And the reason that's difficult is because we've got a language for telling what they should do, programming languages. Natural languages are just not very good at it. And if you need to generate precise detail of what the software is going to do in an A4 style format, you can use tools for that. There's open source Apex Doc, there's Elements Cloud, does a lot of other things, but it also does that. So software first. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So there's a big trust element in working with Agile. We need to trust our customers when we're going to show them rough drafts of what we're going to build, that they're not going to think, oh my God, this is unfinished, this isn't what I wanted, the whole thing's a disaster. We need to be able to show them those drafts and trust them with that. And they need to trust us to start the project with the goals in mind, not the details of how we're going to deliver it. If we get into a contract negotiation which says exactly how we're going to build this software, then we're going to have made a whole load of decisions up front where we don't actually know enough information to be able to make the right decisions there. So if we could build that trust on both sides, then we can get that balance right there. And the last thing they said kind of sums up across all the different points. They talked about responding to change over following a plan. And talking about a better quote about change, or a more moral quote than Mike Tyson, is former President Eisenhower said that plans are useless, but planning is essential. And we know that if you're a senior engineer and you've ever written a plan for a project, you know that that's partially a work of fiction. It's going to change as you go along. But you learn a lot by writing that plan. And if you accept from the beginning that it's going to change, it's a living document, then the whole thing works a lot better. And if we get stuck on being unable to change things, that was one of the things that was directly identified by the DORA people who were doing research into DevOps, is that things like change review boards correlate with poor team performance. They couldn't actually show whether it was caused by it or it was a symptom of it, but if you're unable to make changes without taking it to the wise people who inspect it all, then that gets you worse software in the end. So one of the things that we do in Agile delivery is we deliver things in pieces. And one of the things that I find people sometimes get mixed around is whether they're iterating on a solution or they're incrementing a solution. So I'm going to bore you very hard with this slide on the difference between the two. I do need to give a bit of credit to a guy called Jeff Patton, who's given various talks about Agile, has good blogs about Agile, and I've stolen his pictures, but made a story around them. So if we're building things incrementally, if we were delivering the Mona Lisa incrementally, we might deliver a section of it in full detail first. And then we show that to the customer, build another section, show that to them, and eventually we get to the end and show that to the customer. And so in my experience, most Agile, but not Agile projects, tend to deliver only incrementally. They think they're delivering in small pieces, but they're delivering fully realized pieces of functionality like this. And the downside to this is that you need to know up front exactly what you're building in full detail to be able to deliver it that way. You have to have planned the whole thing up front, which is a bit of a problem. If you imagine this scenario, we deliver that piece, the customer is busy, they go, yeah, it looks about right. Deliver that piece, yeah, it looks about right. And then you get to the end, and it actually turned out that what they wanted was a Mona Lisa horse hybrid, and they couldn't see that until you got to the end. Not great. We have to go all the way back to square one and redesign the whole thing. So if we were to have delivered it a different way, if we were to iterate on it rather than incrementing, we would have shown them the rough sketch, more like how artists actually work. We do a line drawing, we say this is the broad thing that we're trying to create. And they would have said, no, I wanted a centaur. You can fix that then much better. And in the iterative method of working, the next thing we would do is we would fill in a bit more detail, show that to the customer, make sure that works, and then eventually we'd end up at the Mona Lisa. And we get a different kind of thought process up front. We can agree with the customer that this is what we want to build, a picture of a woman in front of a landscape. And that allows us the freedom to discover the right design as we go along through the project. And I said before that I'm not saying that one of these is better than the other. They're times to use the different ones. So to illustrate that, if we go back to our iterative method and we show the customer the line drawing, they're happy. We show them the colors, they're happy. Then we finally get to the end piece, and we're terrible at doing eyes. The best eyes we could do are googly eyes. The customer sees that. Game over, that's not what I wanted. Ridiculous googly eye example, but realistically, there are pieces of software where they have critical performance requirements, critical safety requirements, critical UX requirements, and if you can't meet that bit, the whole thing's done. And so if we were in this sort of scenario where we knew that the eyes were a critical piece of functionality and we didn't know for sure if we could deliver it, then we might increment the eyes and iterate the rest of it, and we might take this kind of blended approach. So neither of these things are the 100% answer of always do this every time, but it's important to know which one you're doing and know why you've done it and do that intentionally and try and fit that to what's right for your project. I'm getting really obsessed about words generally within this, but I think it's really important. And I want to talk about DevOps and deployment and release as particular words, because if we have different concepts behind the words and we talk to each other and we think we've agreed, we can walk away thinking, oh, brilliant. We've got the same picture in our heads, but if we have different meanings of the words, then the whole thing's just completely undermined. So it's pretty clear that DevOps, deployment, and release are actually different things, but people sometimes use them interchangeably. Like, there's more to DevOps than deployment. You can clearly deploy without taking a DevOps approach. And I really want to kind of hone in on the difference between deployment and release on this next slide. So deployment really is when we're moving some code or config between two environments. Release is delivering noticeable changes to the end users. And these are different activities. They have different characteristics, but people tend to treat them the same. So the kind of things you'd expect when you're doing a deployment is you'd expect to run PMD. You'd expect to do these deployments frequently, because the more often we do them, the smaller they are, the less risky they are. We'd expect to have a setup pipeline for these deployments and always use the same pipeline every time. We'd expect to be using source control within all of these things to be able to do these deployments. But releases are different. We shouldn't be doing these too often. They're changing the user experience, and the users will get annoyed if it's changing all the time. And it might require coordination with other teams. It might require extensive UAT, training, announcements, marketing pushes, whatever else. Releases are just a different beast. And I think probably the most common way of releasing stuff in Salesforce probably is to do it with a deployment. But when we do those deployments, they are enormously risky if they have a lot of components. You know, it could take longer than you expected. It might just fall over for reasons that you cannot fathom. And instead of doing that, what we could do is use some sort of notion of feature flagging within the production system so that we deploy incrementally throughout the project, and then when we're ready to release it, we flick a switch and the whole thing's available to the people who need to have it. Now, feature flagging sounds like potentially quite an intimidating thing, but there are circumstances where there are kind of natural feature flags in the system. Like, a very obvious and easy one is if you're building something like a community and experience cloud, the feature is not there until users are in the system. So you can just incrementally build that thing until you're ready and then invite all your users. Or another example that I've had recently on the project was we had a customer who was moving from only working within the UK to working across Europe. And we could deploy incrementally functionality to handle euros, different pricing, different geolocation, all that stuff could go into production, but no one sees that until they start creating accounts in France and Dublin or whatever. So we could do these kind of stealth deployments. We haven't had to create feature flags. The thing becomes live when you start creating data that hits that thing. And Salesforce has loads of options for us as well within our feature flags. We can use permission sets, custom permissions, all sorts of things that we could do within that. And they can have side benefits as well, that many companies use their feature flags as their license model, that the feature flag is what gets switched on when you pay the extra money for that feature. So it's not just like a sunk cost for us. Bit of a sideways step from that into a chat about economics. So there was a guy called Aidan Harding, who is no relation to me. In 1968, had this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which turned out not really to be the tragedy of the commons. What they were talking about was the idea of if we have a common resource like this nice pasture land and everyone acts in their own rational self-interest, what you'll end up with is that the commons will get ruined because everyone will overgraze it for the sake of their own animals, and then nobody will be left with anything to graze on. But this sounds like kind of an invitation to helplessness. We can't have nice things because if we do, everyone will just wreck it. And this turns out not to be true. It was a really influential idea in economics, but that picture is a real picture of common land on Dartmoor. It's there, it's green, the grass is fine. People do actually manage to get along on common land. And the reason they do is because of their incentives. People don't actually work for their own rational self-interest all the time. The people on the common land know that it's their friends and their neighbours that are sharing this thing, and they're incentivized to take all of that into account with how they use the land and how they graze. You think, what's this got to do with software? Well, we could consider our code base to be a commons that we're sharing between all the different teams that are building on that commons. And the resource that we're trying to preserve is the ability to deliver features. And if all the teams were to act in their own rational self-interests, what they end up doing is deteriorating that code base. It becomes messier, muddier, uglier, harder to add new things to until the point where it's just such a mess that no one can add to it. And the thing that we can learn from common land is the incentives are the key. If we give development teams short-term incentives to just deliver as many story points as possible, as fast as possible, then they will ruin the commons. But if we make sure that the incentives actually take into account the whole delivery of the software from beginning to end, like DevOps is supposed to do, then we get to preserve that commons and we get to keep a clean code base that can keep delivering for us. Other big shift, normal accidents. So the picture there is a picture of the control panel from the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor, which, if you're as old as me from those days, you may remember that it had a partial meltdown that was nearly a giant nuclear accident. And there's a book by a guy called Charles Perrow who wrote about this and various other industrial accidents. And he came to the conclusion that in these sorts of systems, this kind of thing is normal. And he characterized systems that are complex as being ones where when you make an input, it's quite hard to predict what the output's going to be because there's so much complexity in between. And he characterized coupled systems as ones where there are lots of different components interacting and they can cascade as things start to go wrong. And if you think of Salesforce and triggers, then you're very much on a similar line. And I think what we need to accept is that accidents in software systems are normal. They should be expected. And there are things that we can actually do about it. Test in production, which kind of sounds like don't test anywhere else, but it's not saying that. Test everywhere else, but also test in production. And by doing that, you're really accepting the world as it really is rather than as you'd like it to be. And if you take that idea throughout your whole project lifecycle and you talk to the customer at the beginning about how you're going to test in production, they're probably going to start sweating because they're going to think, what, this team's going to deliver stuff that doesn't work perfectly. I'd much rather they sweat at that point than they have a heart attack later on when inevitably things start to go wrong and no one's even considered what we're going to do at that point. So if we accept the world as it is, then we have to add some instrumentation, some observability to our system, at least some reports that are going to measure, is this thing working the way that I thought that it should? And by doing that, we can start to see if things are actually working. And if we're doing that and we're fixing small things as we go along, that's like a dry run for the really big incidents. Like if we release something, it's an inconvenience for a dozen users and we notice it and we fix it before they really do, then we're ready for the complete nobody in this geographical region can log into Salesforce type scenario. We're on to the bonus slides, which didn't fit into my DevOps streaming talk. Sorry for delaying you from the pub with my bonus slides there. That's my dog, Aurora. She's lovely. But the main message of the slide is no pets, no Aurora. One of these don't fit into the narrative very well, by the way. So they're just like things that didn't make it to the DevOps streaming slide. So one of the things that we see when things are not going well in kind of how we're running DevOps is people end up with pet environments that they cannot part with, pet sandboxes basically. And it's one of the easy wins that you can have is to chase down the reasons that people have for their pet environments that they refuse to refresh and bring in some automation to try and fix all of those things. If they can't part with their environment because it's got pending changes in it, then they're not going through source control. If they were going through source control, you could just refresh it and put it back in. If they won't do it because it takes them so long to set up all the kind of dependent objects to do their UAT testing, then you need to script putting those objects into the system. If they won't do it because they think they need a partial or a full sandbox every time, well, really, they're kind of exposing themselves to data and privacy issues by always using real data, and maybe they should think about synthesizing stuff and putting that in a dev environment. There aren't really good reasons to have pet environments in Salesforce, and it's a real kind of easy win without adopting all the other stuff that will make your life easier if you can go for it. Second non-DevOps streaming slide. Still not really fitting into the narrative, but here it is. Sandbox sharing. So suppose you have a developer and a non-developer builder in Salesforce working together. So one of you building Apex, the other one's building flows, and we want to come together. So we could build it like this, where everyone has their own sandbox. We go, when we have changes, we push them up into an integration sandbox, then we kind of back pressure those things back in there. That is all possible. DevOps tools exist to help you do this kind of thing. But if we think back to the agile principles of interactions and individuals over processes and tools, I want to say, for God's sake, just talk to each other. Like, just put two people in the same sandbox, talk to each other, and then deliver it as a feature that the two people have worked on. Like, people say that sharing sandboxes is the root of all evil, but actually sometimes it's like pragmatically just easier, and you could talk to each other and resolve these things. Side note, I tried to AI generate an admin and a developer high-fiving, and it generated 24 pictures, so 48 individuals overall, 47 of which were white dudes. So I asked it for not white men, and then it did weird fingers. So ended up with the white men version and relatively normal fingers. Yeah, so wrapping up. Don't confuse Agile TM, the product, for actual agility. Try to take things back to those principles. And if your Scrum or your whatever other methodologies are not working for you, maybe drop them, maybe change how you're using them, but keep in mind what you are actually trying to do. Include all of these factors all the way through the life cycle of the project. If we want to deploy incrementally or iteratively, we need to be talking about that from the very beginning, because the customer's got to be involved with that. And it's not just a dev thing, it's a whole life cycle thing. With respect to our code base, we want to be farmers and custodians of that code base, not just mining it to extract all the features that we can from it and not caring too much about how it ends up. And really, part of the way to do that is to align the incentives. As I say, it comes down to how people are managed and how people are measured, and what's valued within a company will affect the results that you get in this way. Don't be afraid of bugs in production. They're going to happen. Everyone ships bugs. It's just life, sadly. But if we accept that, we can do much more with it. And trust is a big thing through all of this. Like, our customers and ourselves, we have to try to trust each other. Everyone within the team has to trust each other without measuring on these kind of micro incentives. And that really sums up a lot of what's here, a lot of the kind of dysfunctions that you see when people try to implement their deployments, which I hesitate to call DevOps pipelines. They fall down because of lack of trust sometimes. And if we can get to there, that greatly improves things. That was it from me. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Very tangential and unrelated to the core topic, but if you can just go back to that previous slide. What is that cartoon actually representing there?
tools, it says at the bottom.
Yeah, I get that, but I'm trying to work out what it's actually visually showing.
Does anyone recognize that cartoon? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so it was originally subtitled Cow Tools, and it caused an uproar in America because when it was published in the newspaper, everyone was writing into the newspapers going, what does that mean? Like, it's not funny, it's just really aggravating. And I had another slide which didn't make it into the talk about how tools can allow you to actually do things that you ought not to do, kind of like the example of the collaboration by separate sandboxes when you should just talk to each other. And that's where it came from, and I just liked it so much. Sorry.
So I'm trying to remember, you talked about providing incentives. I'm trying to remember the specifics here about, oh God, yeah. So, and I appreciate you talking about alignment. So if we do align those, but I guess the question I had for you was how, like, what are the right incentives to build that culture?
So one of the things that helps is if you're going to do performance-related incentives is to make them aligned to the teams, not the individuals. That makes a big difference. Then you still kind of risk teams being sort of dysfunctional users of the code base. That's still an improvement. What we've traditionally done at our company is just not to have performance incentives in that sort of direct monetary way, and that allows us to judge these things in a more nuanced way of how well people are doing in those things. But it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I've struggled with it in similar capacity, like in developer relations and running a developer relations team, and never really cracked it. So I was curious what you thought about it from a developer team perspective.
If I had the perfect answer, I wouldn't be here. I'd be on my yacht, having made my millions.
That can be the next talk you give. There we go.
Yeah, sorry. I was just saying, I wondered if you've got any tips for building observability into what you're working on, and because that's one of the things you're talking about there.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a good tool for observability that you can just install into. I mean, Rob's waving his hand, but I don't.
No, it's not GearSet. You'll be surprised to learn. So before we even get into a good tool to do that, echoing what Aidan says, hello, talk to each other. If you want observability and knowing what's going on in your org and what's changing in your org, talk to each other. However, if you do want a tool, speak to Nikita Prokopiev at Pharos. Pharos do a great observability tool for Salesforce platforms. Can't say enough great things about that platform, and it's not ours.
Thank you.